hear me? Is the microphone active? Yeah, it works. Okay, good. Well, thank you very, very much, first of all, for your welcome. I'm delighted to be in Argentina. It's my first visit here, and it's a deficit in my CV, which I'm very happy to repair. I'm sorry that I can't do the session in Spanish. This isn't due to any lack of will on my part. Early in my career in the department, I enlisted for Spanish lessons, and just when I was getting to a basic level, my authorities decided to post me to Paris. About 15 years later, I started learning German, whereupon I was posted to Chicago, where German actually would have been quite useful about 200 years earlier, but was no longer in current use. After that, I stopped trying to send signals to my authorities as to where I'd like to be posted. This symposium has been framed in the context of the major historic anniversaries that our respective countries are commemorating this year. Anniversaries are a landmark. They're a time to look back, but also to look forward as well. And I'd like to use my time here to reflect a little bit on the journey that Ireland has travelled from in what began as a quest for independence and led to an embrace of interdependence, and also to look at some of the global challenges that we are now facing. The struggle for Irish freedom was inspired fundamentally by a desire to assume control of our own affairs, and also to express our identity in the form of a state. And of course, that required a measure of international recognition as well. The independence, when it was achieved, was initially qualified, and in particular, we had very limited competence in the areas of foreign affairs and defence. And the first generation of Irish independence was in large measure about pushing out the parameters of that independence, a journey which we could say was probably consummated with the declaration of a republic in 1949. It was perhaps the perverse luck of the Irish that just as we had attained this long-sought status, we found to some extent it was beginning to go out of fashion and to be overtaken by developments in international cooperation and integration. In the 1950s, was probably the period of the purest, most unfettered theoretical sovereignty that the Republic has ever enjoyed. Strictly speaking, legally and theoretically, we could do almost anything, at least until the end of 1955, when we joined the United Nations and became subject to the mandatory authority of the Security Council. But the decade was also one of economic stagnation, recession, high levels of emigration. And the policies that we had adopted of economic self-sufficiency, which were actually rooted in the nationalist ideology of the 1910s and teens, and which also in effect imposed by the autarky observed at the international level in the 1930s, had left us in a situation where, while we had sovereignty, we were not able to use it for the betterment of the prosperity of our people. So it was decided that there needed to be another way. And Dan referred in the car last night to the report by Dr. Ken Whitaker, who was then the Secretary General of our Finance Minister, which charted a new path which involved moving away from the politics of economic protectionism and gradually embracing trade liberalization. And the most important vehicle for that was our membership of the European Union, or we used to call it the Community then, which we applied for initially in 1961 and achieved full membership in 1973. And that provided us with the opportunity to diversify our markets and to compete on the international stage. And we made investments along the way, particularly in education, in upskilling of our people, and also in terms of the environment that we offered to business investment in order to prepare us to take advantage of those opportunities. As Under Secretary Duggan rightly pointed out in his opening remarks, there is a remarkable congruence in the values that guide Argentinian and Irish foreign policy, and indeed, as he mentioned in our bilateral conversation before the session, in our voting patterns at the United Nations. In our case, many of these values can actually be traced back to the 1916 Proclamation of Independence, and indeed further back. Born of our struggles, we have an instinctive sympathy for the problems faced by those whose size, situation, and history leave them relatively powerless, as well as those who are afflicted by poverty or prone to natural disasters. And this can be seen in our approach to issues of justice and human rights, in the engagement we have in international development cooperation and humanitarian aid. And our painful history has also inspired a firm commitment, expressed in our Constitution going back to 1937, to the peaceful settlement of disputes around the world. The world in which we express these values has changed beyond recognition since the Irish state emerged on the international stage. Power has always been contested, but the international environment in which we operate now has become more complex. The post-Cold War international order has been challenged by the crisis in Ukraine, and these problems have been compounded by the rise of other transnational security threats, such as cybersecurity, health pandemics, and also new and more deadly forms of terrorism. Hopes were raised and then dashed by the Arab Spring, and that has led in turn to ongoing conflict and a massive displacement of people across the Middle East and North Africa, spurring the largest movement of people since the end of the Second World War, and also presenting an unparalleled test of the capacity and the coherence of the European Union in responding to them. And more broadly, we're living through a period of enormous societal change, driven in large part by the rise of social media, which enables people to connects people and ideas, and also raises new questions about the relationship between government and people. Despite the small size of our country, our voice has been distinctive, and we like to think respected over the decades at the international level. The question now is, how do we continue to make it heard and to exercise it in a world that is at once more interconnected, but also characterized by an increasing fragmentation at the state level, and by a growing atomization of society. And this requires clear-sighted analysis and good communication, and a capacity to work with countries across the globe to nurture and sustain the partnerships that we have developed over the years. As a member of the European Union, we have a treaty, a commitment to develop a common foreign and security policy. And we are committed to working for common policies and positions which take account of our perspectives wherever this is possible. And when the member states can agree, this amplifies our voice globally. But it is important to remember that the European Union has a common, not a single, foreign and security policy. And where, despite our best efforts, we cannot find agreement within the Union, member states retain the latitude to pursue national policies. And an example, a notable example in Ireland's case, would be in the area of nuclear disarmament. Also, the EU is not an insular project. It's not intended to operate alone. In the treaties, the foreign and security policy is framed by a commitment to global governance and to uphold fundamental values and to work cooperatively through the United Nations system. And we recognize the importance in that context of interregional cooperation, and in particular with regional organizations like Mercosur, which are traveling their own path in relation to regional integration. There has been much mention in the earlier presentations of the importance of values. And something of a conundrum at the moment is the question of how we articulate our values with our interests. These are often perceived to be oppositional. And it's true that sometimes there are certain tensions between them. It is argued that we have to deal with the world as it is and not as we would like it to be. But this is not to say that we accept that reality. It's just that we have to contend with it as we seek to change it for the better. Fundamentally, we do not believe that there is a dichotomy between interests and values, or that a binary choice has to be made between them. Sometimes it's in our interest to promote our values, and our values are driven by principle, and it's in our enlightened self-interest to pursue them. As a trading nation, we rely on secure and predictable access to global markets and on the health and well-being of our economic partners. We are too small to make the international political and economic weather, so we have an interest in a rules-based international order and on the prevalence of global security and stability. At the root of the problems of conflict and instability that we see around the world, we almost invariably find repression and denial of human rights, poverty and underdevelopment, and poor governance. And any necessary short-term measures we might take to address the immediate symptoms must be complemented by longer-term strategies to tackle the underlying causes. Otherwise, we will be condemned to face the same problems in perpetuity. Nationally, we are redoubling our efforts to harness the traditional instruments of our international engagement in an integrated policy approach. Development cooperation to help developing countries build their own economies, investing not just in economic infrastructure, but also in capacity building in areas of human and social capital, including good governance, rule of law, human rights, and empowering a civil society. Conflict prevention and resolution. We have a continuous 58-year presence in UN peacekeeping operations around the world, a tradition that we share proudly with Argentina. This is part of the strength. We're also trying to bring to the conflict resolution area the experience of the lessons we have very often painfully learned in our own experience in the peace process in Northern Ireland. And peacekeeping, as I said, is to preserve the space for these conflict resolution processes and for negotiated solutions. Arms control and disarmament to deal with the weapons that fuel conflict. To conclude, collectively we face a daunting global agenda, but we can take encouragement from some major recent multilateral achievements. The agreement on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the closely related Global Climate Agreement concluded in Paris last year. If I may say so, Irish fingerprints were on both. We co-facilitated the Agenda 2030 negotiations, and our former President, Barrie Robinson, who paid, I think, the first state visit to Argentina by an Irish head of state in 1995, and I see is pictorially represented in the gallery outside. She was the Secretary General's, the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Climate. In fact, in the middle of last year, while these processes were ongoing, UN Secretary General Ban, on a visit to Ireland, remarked, jokingly we hoped, that if these negotiations failed, that would be Ireland's fault. Fortunately, the outcome was sort of confounded those fears. We've now been entrusted with the co-facilitation role in preparing the UN summit on migration, on migrants and refugees in September of this year. I think that these processes and these developments illustrate both the enduring potential of multilateral cooperation and also the central role that small countries like Ireland and with honesty of purpose can bring to the effort to find common agreement and to broker solutions. Thank you very much.